The ace of spades landed face up in a pool of spreading darkness at precisely 9:37 in the evening. Hendrik Van der Berg's fingers had released the card mid-shuffle as the first convulsion seized his substantial frame, his body crashing backward into a mahogany chair that splintered like kindling beneath 200 pounds of dying flesh. Across the green felt table, 4 other men clutched at their throats, their eyes widening with the terrible recognition that this poker night would be their last. In the kitchen 30 meters away, Kimena Okoye watched through the service window as the Congo's wealthiest rubber barons discovered that some debts cannot be settled with money or land or the lives of people they considered property. This is the story of how one enslaved cook transformed a gentleman's card game into a funeral, and why his recipe for justice would poison the conscience of an entire colonial empire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The year stood at 1911, and the Domaine Rouge rose from the Congolese landscape like a monument to European ambition built on African suffering. The estate sprawled across 3,000 hectares of land that had been claimed, not purchased, during the rubber boom that made kings of merchants and corpses of countless thousands who worked the trees until their hands bled white latex. The main house commanded a hillside overlooking a tributary of the mighty Congo River, its 3 stories of whitewashed stone glowing against the dense wall of jungle that pressed in from all sides as if waiting for the moment when nature would reclaim what had been stolen from her. Wide verandas wrapped the structure like the arms of a creature preparing to squeeze, their railings carved from Irako wood by craftsmen whose names would never appear in any register of the estate's construction. Tonight the house blazed with lamplight that spilled golden across manicured lawns where peacocks imported from India strutted between flowerbeds planted with roses that had no business surviving in equatorial heat. The scent of night-blooming jasmine mixed uneasily with the ever-present humidity that made European clothing cling like second skin, while the distant sound of drums from the worker villages provided a rhythm that the plantation owners had long since learned to ignore. Inside the grand salon converted for tonight's purpose into a gambling den worthy of any European capital, crystal decanters caught the glow of oil lamps and threw amber patterns across walls paneled in African blackwood that had required the labor of 200 men to harvest and install. The monthly poker tournament had become an institution among the region's colonial elite, a gathering that merged the civilized pretense of European culture with the brutal reality of their wealth's origin. 5 men controlled nearly half the rubber production in the Leopoldville region, their fortunes built on a system that reduced human beings to production units measured by the kilograms of latex they could extract before exhaustion or disease or deliberate cruelty ended their usefulness. Tonight marked the tournament's 3rd anniversary, a celebration that would feature stakes higher than ever before. The pot already included land concessions worth hundreds of thousands of francs, mining rights to territories not yet fully explored, and the contracts of skilled workers who would change hands like livestock at auction. Kimena moved through the kitchen quarters with the fluid efficiency of someone who had learned that survival required becoming invisible while remaining indispensable. At 38 years old, his hands bore the scars of 2 decades serving masters who had never bothered to learn his language or acknowledge his humanity beyond the meals he prepared. His dark eyes held an intelligence that plantation owners mistook for simple competence, their inability to imagine complex thought in African minds serving as the perfect camouflage for someone planning their systematic destruction. The kitchen itself occupied a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway that allowed dishes to travel the distance without excessive cooling, though the Congolese heat made this concern largely theoretical. The space measured 15 meters square with a ceiling that rose to accommodate the heat from 4 cooking stations, their fires fed by wood that workers hauled from the forest each morning before their shifts in the rubber groves began. Steam rose from copper pots imported from Brussels, the air thick with aromas that blended European techniques with ingredients that could only be sourced from the Congo's interior. Roasted guinea fowl glazed with palm wine reduction shared space with cassava prepared in 3 distinct styles, while plantains caramelized in butter that had been shipped upriver at enormous expense because Van der Berg insisted that proper cuisine required ingredients from civilization rather than relying entirely on what he termed jungle provisions. Kimena had spent the afternoon preparing tonight's feast with particular attention to detail, each dish representing a course and a meal that would be remembered not for its flavors but for the silence that would follow the final serving. The kitchen staff numbered 12 on normal days, but Kimena had quietly arranged for most of them to be occupied elsewhere tonight. He'd sent 3 workers to the storehouse with instructions to reorganize supplies that didn't require reorganizing. He'd convinced 2 others that the chicken coop needed immediate repairs despite showing no signs of damage. The remaining staff consisted only of Bisimwa, a young man whose sister had been sold to a diamond mining operation 3 months earlier after she'd resisted the advances of an overseer. Bisimwa understood what tonight represented without requiring explicit explanation. The 2 men worked in synchronized silence, their movements carrying the weight of shared purpose that transcended the need for words. The poison had required 6 weeks of careful preparation, extraction, and testing on animals whose deaths provided data about dosage and timing. Kimena had learned the secrets of cassava processing from Bwana Lokila during his childhood in a village that existed now only in memory, burned to ash during a punitive expedition after workers failed to meet their rubber quotas. The elder had taught him that bitter cassava roots contained compounds that transformed into cyanide when processed incorrectly, a defense mechanism that the plant had evolved to protect itself from consumption. Traditional preparation methods involved soaking, fermenting, and cooking in specific sequences that neutralized the toxins, rendering the starchy root safe and nutritious. But reverse that knowledge, concentrate rather than dilute, and the same plant became an instrument of death that left almost no trace for colonial doctors to identify. The extraction process had taken place in a hidden clearing 3 kilometers into the jungle, where Kimena had constructed a small shelter that allowed him to work without observation. He'd harvested bitter cassava from wild patches that grew beyond the plantation's cultivated areas, selecting roots with the highest concentration of linamarin based on taste tests that required him to spit immediately after the briefest contact with his tongue. The roots were then peeled and grated into a paste that he allowed to ferment in sealed containers, accelerating the conversion of glycosides into hydrogen cyanide. The resulting liquid was carefully reduced over low heat until it achieved a concentration that would prove lethal in doses small enough to be masked by the complex flavors of tonight's menu. Kimena had tested his preparation on plantation rats, documenting the progression of symptoms with marks scratched into the bark of a mahogany tree that served as his laboratory journal. The initial exposure produced no immediate effects, allowing the victims to continue normal activity for 15 to 20 minutes. The first symptoms manifested as a pleasant warmth and slight dizziness that might be attributed to alcohol consumption, followed rapidly by headache and confusion. Within 30 minutes, respiratory distress would begin as the cyanide prevented cells from utilizing oxygen, effectively suffocating victims from the inside regardless of how deeply they breathed. Death typically occurred between 45 minutes and 2 hours after ingestion, depending on body weight and the amount consumed. The poker tournament guests had begun arriving at 7 in the evening, their automobiles and horse-drawn carriages forming a parade of colonial wealth along the curved driveway that approached the main house. Philippe Duchamp emerged from a Renault whose engine had been specially modified to handle Congo's primitive roads, his portly frame squeezed into a white linen suit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That showed dark patches of sweat despite the evening hour. Edward Thornhill arrived on horseback, a theatrical gesture intended to demonstrate his comfort with frontier conditions. Those servants immediately took the reins and led the animal away before it could deposit anything unpleasant near the entrance. Antonio Ferreira and Carl Zimmerman came together, having concluded business earlier in the day at the Colonial Administration offices where they'd successfully lobbied for expanded land concessions that would displace another 6 villages. Hendrik Van der Berg greeted each arrival with cognac and cigars, his booming voice carrying across the veranda as he recounted exaggerated tales of his latest hunting expedition. The host stood nearly 2 meters tall with a build that had once been athletic but had softened considerably during 20 years of colonial prosperity. His red face gleamed with perspiration and self-satisfaction as he guided his guests toward the salon where tonight's game would unfold, their laughter echoing off walls decorated with mounted animal heads that represented trophies taken from a continent they viewed as an inexhaustible source of resources and entertainment. The 5 men had known each other for years, their fortunes intertwined through business partnerships and shared interests in maintaining the colonial order that made their wealth possible. They discussed rubber prices and labor management techniques with the same casual tone other men might use to debate weather or sporting events, their conversation peppered with complaints about the inconvenience of new regulations that limited the most extreme forms of physical punishment. Van der Berg mentioned casually that he'd recently sold a particularly troublesome worker to a mining operation, disposing of the problem with the same thought he might give to discarding a broken tool. Kimena had been serving these men for 7 years, present but invisible during countless dinners where they debated the futures of people whose names they never learned. He'd listened to Duchamp describe his technique for motivating workers through calculated brutality. He'd heard Thornhill joke about the ridiculously low prices fetched by Congolese laborers compared to equipment costs. He'd watched Ferreira count his money while discussing the children who worked his coffee plantations, their small hands supposedly better suited for picking beans though their susceptibility to disease and injury made them disposable assets in his accounting. He'd served Zimmerman wine while the German trader negotiated the sale of Kimena's own son. Amara had been 17 years old, tall and strong with his mother's eyes and a quick mind that had drawn unwanted attention from overseers who viewed intelligence in African workers as either useful or threatening depending on their mood. Zimmerman had been expanding his trading network inland and required guides who could speak multiple tribal languages and navigate territories that remained largely unmapped by European standards. He'd offered Van der Berg 200 francs for the boy, a price that the plantation owner accepted with the same consideration he'd give to selling a moderately valuable horse. Kimena had begged Van der Berg to reconsider, had offered to work double shifts, had promised anything if his son could remain. The plantation owner had laughed and suggested that perhaps Kimena should focus on improving his cassava recipes rather than concerning himself with business transactions that were frankly none of his affair. Amara had been taken 3 months ago, shackled and loaded onto a river boat that would carry him hundreds of kilometers into the interior where trading posts operated beyond even the minimal oversight that existed in more established regions. Kimena had received no word about his son's fate, no information about whether he still lived or had joined the uncounted thousands who died in service to European commerce. The silence had been worse than confirmed death, leaving him to imagine scenarios that stole sleep and made breathing feel like labor. That silence had also crystallized his resolve and focused his planning toward this singular night. The cassava poison had been distributed with surgical precision throughout the evening's menu. The appetizer course featured smoked fish with a sauce that masked the compound's faint bitterness beneath layers of tamarind and chili. The main course included guinea fowl glazed with a reduction that contained the highest concentration, calculated to ensure that even guests who ate sparingly from other dishes would receive a lethal dose. Side dishes carried lesser amounts, supplementing the primary delivery method and ensuring that no one would escape through pure chance of selective eating. The bread served alongside the meal had been brushed with contaminated palm oil, transforming every element of dinner into a vector for justice that no colonial doctor would recognize. The poker game had commenced at 8 o'clock with initial bets that seemed almost modest by these men's standards. 500 francs to open, land rights worth 10 times that amount pushed into the pot center, promissory notes representing workers' contracts stacked beside piles of Belgian currency. The cards were dealt and received, the players settling into familiar patterns of bluff and calculation while servants moved silently around the room's periphery. Kimena supervised the first course's delivery, watching as Bisimwa placed dishes before men who didn't acknowledge his existence beyond ensuring their plates landed in proper position. The fish disappeared quickly, proclaimed excellent by Duchamp, who prided himself on sophisticated palate despite his general coarseness in other matters. The main course arrived at 8:45, carried on silver platters that reflected lamplight like captured stars. Kimena supervised the presentation with the same meticulous attention he brought to every meal, ensuring that each plate displayed artistic arrangement worthy of any European restaurant. The guinea fowl glistened beneath its glaze, the meat falling from the bone with the tenderness that only slow roasting could achieve. Roasted plantains formed a golden semicircle on each plate, their natural sweetness enhanced by the butter and honey treatment that made them a particular favorite of Van der Berg. Cassava prepared 3 ways occupied the remaining space, each preparation method showcasing different aspects of the root's versatility while simultaneously delivering the compound that would stop their hearts. The poker players paused their game long enough to acknowledge the food's arrival, their appreciation expressed through the kind of casual praise that men of their station offered to servants they considered extensions of the furniture. Thornhill commented that the aroma alone justified the monthly journey from his mining territories 2 days upriver. Ferreira raised his wine glass toward the kitchen doorway where Kimena stood observing, a gesture that might have seemed appreciative had it not been accompanied by the Portuguese trader's comment that at least the Congolese were good for something when properly trained. The other men laughed, their mirth fueled by wine and the comfortable certainty that their world would continue exactly as they had constructed it. Zimmerman dealt the next hand while the players ate, his thick fingers manipulating cards with surprising dexterity for someone whose primary business involved commodities rather than gambling. The German had accumulated the largest pile of winnings so far tonight, his aggressive betting style pushing the others into positions where they either folded or committed resources they couldn't afford to lose. He'd already claimed 1,000 hectares of prime rubber territory from Duchamp and held promissory notes representing 24 skilled workers that Thornhill had wagered during an ill-advised bluff 3 hands earlier. The stakes continued climbing as the night progressed, each round pushing larger amounts of wealth across the green felt surface. Van der Berg consumed his guinea fowl with the enthusiasm of someone who viewed eating as both pleasure and competitive sport. His plate emptied quickly, sopped clean with bread that absorbed every trace of glaze and sauce. He called for seconds before the other players had finished their firsts, his appetite legendary among the colonial community where excess was viewed as evidence of success rather than gluttony. Kimena watched the plantation owner demolish the additional serving, calculating dosages in his mind and confirming that Van der Berg had now consumed enough poison to kill 3 men of average size. The host would be the first to die, fitting justice for the man who had sold Amara without hesitation or remorse. The conversation around the poker table ranged across topics that revealed the casual brutality underlying their prosperity. Duchamp described his latest innovation in labor management, a quota system that punished entire villages when individual workers failed to meet rubber collection targets. The collective punishment approach had proven remarkably effective at motivating productivity, he explained, because workers who might endure personal suffering would labor to exhaustion rather than see their families starve. Thornhill countered with his own technique involving mining accidents that he suggested weren't entirely accidental, strategic removals of workers who showed signs of organizing resistance or spreading discontent among their peers. Ferreira shared an anecdote about a young worker on his coffee plantation who'd attempted escape 3 times before being recaptured. Rather than simply executing the boy as example, Ferreira had sold him to a particularly brutal overseer at a coastal trading post, ensuring that the escapee's fate would become legend among other workers who might contemplate similar action. The sale had netted Ferreira a modest profit while simultaneously serving as deterrent, what he termed efficient management that achieved multiple objectives through single action. Zimmerman nodded approvingly, mentioning that he'd recently acquired several workers with similar histories, young men whose rebellious tendencies could be redirected toward hazardous tasks in territories where their survival mattered less than their temporary utility. Kimena listened to these men discuss the destruction of lives with the same detachment they might bring to debating agricultural techniques or equipment maintenance. They spoke of human beings as production units and disposal problems, their language stripped of any acknowledgement that the workers they traded and punished and worked to death were fathers and sons and brothers. He thought about Amara forced to march into territories where disease and violence killed more efficiently than any deliberate cruelty, about the boy's mother who had died during a cholera outbreak that swept through the worker villages because Van der Berg had refused to invest in basic sanitation improvements. He thought about the countless others whose names he'd never known but whose suffering had been just as real and undeserved. The kitchen remained mostly silent except for the sounds of cleaning in preparation for dessert service. Bisimwa worked with focused intensity, his movements carrying the controlled energy of someone managing powerful emotions through physical activity. The young man had been present when his sister was loaded onto a transport wagon, had watched her scream and beg while overseers laughed and placed bets on how long she'd survive in the diamond fields. That image had apparently burned itself into his mind with the permanence of a brand, shaping everything that followed. When Kimena had first approached him about tonight's plan, Bisimwa had required no convincing, no elaborate justification or moral argument. He'd simply asked what needed to be done and when. The card game continued through the main course and into the brief interval before dessert. The pot had grown to staggering proportions, representing wealth that could have fed entire villages for years but instead sat piled in the center of a gambling table. Land concessions covering territories larger than some European countries, mining rights to regions that geological surveys suggested contained vast mineral deposits, contracts controlling hundreds of workers whose labor would generate fortunes for whoever claimed them. The 5 men played for stakes that would determine the economic landscape of the region for decades, their decisions affecting thousands of lives that they valued only as instruments of profit. Van der Berg's pile had diminished considerably as the evening progressed, his aggressive style working against him when the cards refused to cooperate. He'd already lost the promissory notes for 12 workers and a section of premium rubber forest to Zimmerman's steady accumulation. Duchamp fared slightly better, having recouped some earlier losses through conservative play that prioritized preservation over expansion. Thornhill and Ferreira occupied middle positions, winning some hands and losing others in patterns that suggested their minds had begun to wander from the game toward other considerations. The dessert course featured a creation that had required 2 full days of preparation. Layered confection built from cassava flour transformed into delicate cake, tropical fruits reduced into concentrated sweetness, and cream imported at enormous expense from a dairy operation 300 kilometers downriver. The presentation approached artwork, each plate displaying geometric precision in the arrangement of components. Chocolate sauce drizzled in patterns that created visual interest while simultaneously masking the final dose of poison, ensuring that even guests who had eaten sparingly from earlier courses would receive sufficient compound to achieve the desired effect. Kimena had calculated that dessert would be consumed approximately 90 minutes after the first course, timing that meant symptoms would begin manifesting around 10 o'clock when the poker game would presumably be reaching its most intense phase. The players received their desserts with enthusiasm that transcended their usual restrained appreciation. Even men accustomed to the finest European cuisine found themselves impressed by the complexity and balance of flavors that Kimena had achieved. Ferreira declared it the best dessert he'd consumed anywhere in the Congo, a compliment that carried the implicit assumption that nothing created by African hands could rival European sophistication. Zimmerman consumed his portion methodically, savoring each element before moving to the next, his systematic approach to eating matching his calculated gambling style. Duchamp finished quickly and loudly suggested that perhaps they should play cards every week if the food continued at this standard. The sound of thunder rumbled across the distant jungle, announcing the evening rain that arrived with meteorological regularity in this equatorial climate. Within minutes, water began hammering the roof with tropical intensity, creating a drumming rhythm that made conversation require raised voices. The downpour would last anywhere from 20 minutes to several hours, transforming the plantation grounds into a landscape of red mud and flowing water that made movement treacherous. The timing struck Kimena as appropriate, nature itself providing percussion for the evening's finale. Van der Berg called for brandy to accompany the dessert, and servants produced bottles of cognac that bore labels proclaiming vintages older than some of the workers who had died extracting the rubber that paid for such luxuries. The 5 men raised their glasses in toasts to prosperity and continued success, their words slurring slightly in ways they attributed to alcohol rather than recognizing as early symptoms of the poison now flooding their bloodstreams. The card game resumed with a hand that would never be completed, the final deal of a tournament that had run its course. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong came at 9:32 when Duchamp attempted to place a bet but found his fingers refusing to cooperate with the simple task of pushing chips toward the pot's center. His hand trembled noticeably, the tremor spreading up his arm while confusion crossed his features. He attributed the difficulty to excessive drinking, making a joke about needing to show more restraint with Van der Berg's excellent cognac. The other players laughed, though Thornhill's chuckle transformed into a cough that he couldn't seem to stop, his face reddening as he struggled to draw breath that his body could no longer process effectively. Ferreira stood abruptly, his chair toppling backward as vertigo seized him. He gripped the table edge for support, knocking over his brandy glass and sending amber liquid spreading across the green felt surface. The Portuguese trader tried to speak but produced only incoherent sounds, his tongue and lips refusing to form words while his eyes widened with the dawning realization that something terrible was happening. Zimmerman rose to assist him but staggered sideways, his coordination destroyed by the cyanide preventing his cells from utilizing oxygen regardless of how desperately his lungs continued their futile labor. Van der Berg remained seated but his massive frame had begun convulsing, muscles contracting in spasms that grew increasingly violent. The cards he'd been holding scattered across the table, the ace of spades landing face up in the spreading pool of spilled brandy. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his face transitioning through shades of red to purple to an alarming blue-gray that signaled complete respiratory failure. The other guests who had been observing the game from chairs positioned around the salon's perimeter began shouting for help, their voices rising in panic that competed with the thunder still rumbling outside. Kimena stood in the kitchen doorway with Bisimwa beside him, the two men watching the chaos unfold with expressions that mixed satisfaction with something deeper and more complex. This wasn't merely revenge for personal grievances, though those certainly fueled their actions. This was a statement about the fundamental injustice of a system that reduced human beings to commodities, that allowed men like Van der Berg and his companions to trade lives like poker chips while congratulating themselves on their civilizing influence. The screaming and confusion in the salon represented a tiny fraction of the suffering that these 5 men had inflicted across years of exploitation, but it was a fraction delivered with precision and purpose. Servants rushed into the salon from various parts of the house, their training overriding personal feelings as they attempted to provide assistance to men who were already beyond any help. One worker tried to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on Thornhill, unaware that forcing air into lungs that couldn't process oxygen served no purpose. Another ran toward the main gate screaming for the plantation doctor, though the medical man lived 3 kilometers away and the rain had transformed roads into impassable rivers of mud. The remaining observers stood frozen in shock, their minds unable to process the reality that all 5 poker players were dying simultaneously from no apparent cause. Duchamp collapsed face first onto the poker table, his substantial weight causing the structure to crack ominously. Cards and chips scattered in all directions while his body continued its involuntary spasms, muscles firing randomly as his nervous system short-circuited. Ferreira had fallen to his knees, his hands clutching at his throat in the universal gesture of someone who cannot breathe, though the problem existed at the cellular level where no amount of air could reverse the cyanide's work. Zimmerman lay on his back staring at the ceiling, his chest heaving with the effort of drawing breaths that provided no relief, his eyes holding a question that would never be answered. The entire catastrophe from first symptoms to complete incapacitation had taken less than 10 minutes, the poison working with efficiency that Kimena's careful testing had predicted. Van der Berg died first, his final breath escaping in a rattle that sounded like wind through hollow reeds. Thornhill followed within seconds, his body going suddenly still after a particularly violent convulsion. Duchamp, Ferreira, and Zimmerman lingered slightly longer, their deaths delayed by marginally lower doses or stronger constitutions, but the outcome remained inevitable. By 9:45, all 5 poker players lay dead or dying while rain continued hammering the roof and thunder provided appropriate accompaniment to the scene. The other guests in attendance began backing toward exits, their panic overriding any impulse toward investigation or assistance. Several men who held positions of authority in the colonial administration started shouting orders that nobody followed, their commands meaningless in the face of wholesale disaster. Someone suggested poison, the words spreading through the gathering like fire through dry grass. Eyes turned toward the kitchen, toward the servants, toward the invisible people who had prepared tonight's feast. Accusations began forming before any evidence existed, the automatic assumption that African servants must be responsible for any calamity that befell European masters. Kimena knew he had perhaps 15 minutes before organized response would begin. The initial chaos provided cover, but soon someone would remember to secure exits and prevent anyone from leaving the estate. He touched Bisimwa's shoulder briefly, a signal they had arranged earlier, and the 2 men separated to follow different escape routes that had been planned down to individual steps. Bisimwa would head toward the worker villages where sympathetic residents would provide temporary shelter before he continued north toward territories beyond colonial control. Kimena's path led toward the river and a dugout canoe hidden beneath overhanging vegetation 200 meters downstream from the estate's boat dock. The rain actually aided his escape, reducing visibility while masking sounds that might otherwise have drawn attention. Kimena moved through the darkness with confidence born from years of navigating these grounds, his feet finding purchase on paths that European overseers had never bothered to learn. He carried nothing except the clothes on his back and knowledge that could not be confiscated, everything else abandoned without hesitation. Material possessions meant nothing compared to the satisfaction of knowing that 5 of the Congo's worst exploiters would never again trade human lives across poker tables or laugh about the suffering they inflicted with such casual indifference. Behind him, the Domaine Rouge erupted into chaos that would eventually bring colonial authorities from Leopoldville and beyond. Ahead lay the Congo River and the vast interior territories where European control existed more in theory than practice, where communities that had resisted colonization would provide sanctuary for someone who had struck such a devastating blow against the oppressors. The river flowed dark and swift beneath rain that showed no signs of diminishing, its waters carrying him toward a future that remained uncertain but would at minimum be free from the particular hell of serving men who viewed him as property rather than person. The card game's final hand remained unfinished on the table, its outcome rendered meaningless by circumstances that trumped any pot size or gambling strategy. 5 plantation owners had entered the evening expecting nothing more eventful than the usual redistribution of wealth among themselves. They left as corpses, their bodies cooling while their business empires began the process of dissolution that would follow any sudden vacancy in leadership. The poker chips and currency and promissory notes scattered across the green felt surface represented fortunes that would now pass to heirs and partners and competitors, but the 5 men who had accumulated that wealth through systematic brutality would never again profit from others' suffering. Captain Jules Mercier arrived at Domaine Rouge shortly after midnight, his automobile struggling through muddy roads that had transformed into treacherous channels of flowing red clay. The colonial officer commanded the regional security force responsible for maintaining order across 300 kilometers of territory that the Belgian administration claimed but only nominally controlled. He'd received word of the incident through telegraph from a panicked subordinate who'd been among the poker tournament's peripheral guests, and the garbled message had conveyed enough urgency to justify the dangerous nighttime journey. The rain had finally diminished to a persistent drizzle by the time Mercier's vehicle crested the hill approaching the estate, its headlamps illuminating a scene of remarkable confusion. Workers and guests milled about the grounds in clusters that formed and dissolved like living organisms, their conversations creating a hum of speculation and fear that rose above the sound of dripping water. The main house blazed with every lamp lit, as if brightness could somehow push back the darkness of what had occurred within its walls. Mercier strode through the front entrance with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority, his uniform still crisp despite the humid conditions and his expression revealing nothing of whatever thoughts occupied his mind. A servant directed him toward the salon where the bodies remained exactly as they had fallen, nobody having possessed sufficient presence of mind to disturb what was clearly a crime scene of unprecedented magnitude. The captain stood in the doorway surveying the tableau for several minutes before entering the room. His methodical nature served him well in situations that caused others to panic, allowing him to observe details that more emotional responses might overlook. 5 dead men arranged around a poker table like participants in some macabre theatrical production. Cards and currency and valuable documents scattered across felt that bore stains from spilled alcohol and other fluids. The smell of death already beginning to assert itself despite the relatively short time since the men had expired. Mercier noted the positions of the bodies, the expressions frozen on their faces, the overturned furniture that suggested sudden onset rather than gradual deterioration. Dr. Henri Beaumont had preceded Mercier's arrival by perhaps 20 minutes, summoned from his residence in a nearby colonial settlement. The physician knelt beside Van der Berg's corpse conducting an examination that appeared more thorough than the circumstances strictly required. Beaumont possessed actual medical credentials from a French university, unlike many colonial doctors who had acquired their positions through connections rather than competence. His presence in the Congo stemmed from gambling debts that made Europe inadvisable, but his skills remained sharp despite the circumstances that had driven him to Africa. He looked up as Mercier approached, his expression troubled in ways that suggested his examination had revealed complications. The preliminary assessment indicated poisoning, though Beaumont couldn't immediately identify the specific compound responsible. The symptoms matched several possible toxins, but the rapid onset and simultaneous effect on all 5 victims suggested something unusually potent delivered in carefully calculated doses. The doctor pointed out the bluish discoloration of the skin, the foam at the corners of mouths, the positions of hands clutched at throats or chests. These men hadn't died from any natural cause or accidental contamination. Someone had deliberately introduced a lethal substance into their systems, timing and dosage suggesting knowledge that went beyond lucky accident or crude poisoning attempt. Mercier's initial inspection of the dining area revealed plates scraped clean, wine glasses emptied, dessert dishes showing only faint traces of what had been consumed. The thoroughness with which the victims had eaten suggested nothing unusual about the meal's taste or presentation. Whatever poison had been used, it had been masked so completely that 5 experienced men accustomed to fine dining had detected no warning signs. The captain noted the serving platters still arranged on the sideboard, their remaining contents potentially valuable as evidence. He ordered subordinates to secure everything related to food service, prohibiting anyone from touching or removing items until proper analysis could be conducted. The salon itself told a story of interrupted leisure transformed into desperate emergency. Poker chips lay scattered across the floor where they'd fallen during the initial chaos, their bright colors creating strange contrast against the somber reality of death. A cognac bottle had shattered near one of the bodies, its contents mixing with blood and other fluids in ways that made the carpet's pattern unrecognizable. The walls bore marks where panicked guests had grabbed at paintings and decorative elements while attempting to flee, their fear leaving physical evidence of the terror that had erupted in this space designed for comfortable entertainment. Mercier questioned the surviving guests systematically, his interviews revealing a consistent narrative. The evening had proceeded normally until shortly after dessert service when multiple victims had shown signs of distress within minutes of each other. Nobody had noticed anything unusual about the food or drink, no strange tastes or suspicious circumstances during meal service. The poker game had been progressing as expected with the usual banter and competition. Then suddenly 5 men were dying and chaos had erupted before anyone could mount effective response. The surviving guests represented various levels of colonial society from minor officials to successful traders, but none possessed information beyond their own observations of the catastrophe's visible manifestation. One witness, a Belgian merchant named Laurent Dubois, provided particularly detailed account of the evening's progression. He'd been seated near the poker table observing the game while nursing a brandy, position where he could watch both the players and the general flow of activity in the salon. Dubois described how the main course had arrived with impressive presentation, how the players had paused their game to eat, how conversation had ranged across business matters and colonial gossip. He remembered Van der Berg calling for seconds, remembered Zimmerman's methodical approach to consuming his meal, remembered Duchamp's enthusiastic praise for the dessert. Nothing in any of these observations suggested anything amiss until the moment when coordination began failing and breathing became labored. Another witness, a junior colonial administrator named François Petit, had been standing near the doorway that connected to the covered walkway leading toward the kitchen. He'd noticed servants moving back and forth during dinner service, their efficiency creating smooth flow of courses without obvious disruption. What struck him as unusual in retrospect was the reduction in kitchen staff visible during the later portions of the evening. Earlier there had been perhaps 6 or 7 workers managing service, but by the time dessert arrived, he'd only seen 2 individuals. The diminishing presence hadn't seemed significant at the time, but now it suggested coordination that went beyond spontaneous flight after the poisoning became apparent. The kitchen became the obvious focus of investigation, and Mercier moved toward the separate building with several subordinates trailing behind. The space showed signs of hasty departure, with cooking implements abandoned mid-cleaning and dishes left in positions suggesting interrupted work. More significantly, the kitchen staff had vanished completely. Not a single worker remained from the dozen or more who would typically have been present during such an elaborate dinner service. The disappearance pointed toward guilt with an obviousness that Mercier found almost Suspicious, as if someone wanted authorities to draw exactly that conclusion. The cooking stations revealed professional organization that spoke to genuine culinary expertise. Spices were arranged by type and frequency of use, knives hung in order of size and purpose, pots nested efficiently to maximize limited storage space. This was a kitchen managed by someone who understood food preparation not just as necessary labor but as craft worthy of systematic approach. Mercier found himself grudgingly impressed despite the circumstances, recognizing that whoever had planned tonight's massacre possessed intelligence and capability that challenged comfortable assumptions about African workers' mental capacities. A thorough search of the kitchen revealed additional troubling details that deepened the mystery. Behind a loose brick in the wall near the main cooking station, investigators discovered a small cloth bundle containing dried plant materials that Beaumont couldn't immediately identify. The leaves and roots had been carefully preserved and wrapped with precision that suggested medicinal or toxic applications rather than culinary use. Near the preparation tables, investigators found scratches in the wooden surface that appeared deliberate rather than accidental, marks that might represent some form of notation or measurement system. The implications were disturbing because they suggested planning that extended far beyond the single evening's events. The storage areas yielded more evidence of systematic preparation. Containers that should have held standard ingredients showed residue from substances that didn't match their labels. A jar marked for honey contained traces of something bitter that made one investigator gag when he carelessly touched it to his tongue. Clay pots used for fermenting traditional foods showed signs of being employed for other purposes, their interiors stained in patterns inconsistent with normal food preparation. Each discovery reinforced the conclusion that someone with extensive knowledge had been working in this kitchen for weeks or months, conducting experiments and refining techniques while maintaining the appearance of routine meal service. Mercier ordered his men to catalog every item in the kitchen, creating an inventory that might reveal patterns or missing elements that could aid the investigation. The process consumed hours and produced a document running to several pages, but the effort yielded limited immediate results. Whoever had orchestrated the poisoning had been careful to remove or destroy evidence that might directly implicate them or reveal their methods. The remaining materials suggested sophistication and knowledge without providing clear pathways toward identifying specific individuals or predicting their current locations. Father Matthias arrived as dawn began breaking over the Congo River, the missionary priest having traveled through darkness at Mercier's request. The Jesuit maintained detailed records of the African population in territories surrounding Leopoldville, his evangelical work providing cover for what amounted to census-taking that colonial authorities found useful. If anyone could identify the missing kitchen workers and provide background information about their histories and potential motivations, Matthias would be that person. The priest moved through the kitchen with careful attention, noting details that others might miss, his eyes holding the sharp intelligence of someone who understood that his position required diplomatic navigation between European power and African reality. Matthias recognized implements and ingredients that suggested someone with considerable culinary sophistication had been working in this space. The arrangement of cooking stations indicated efficient workflow designed by someone who understood food preparation at levels beyond simple subsistence cooking. The quality of stored spices and specialty ingredients revealed a kitchen program that took pride in its output, investing resources in ways that purely functional operations wouldn't bother. The priest commented that finding staff of this caliber represented significant achievement in colonial territories where trained cooks commanded premium compensation. Losing such workers would damage any plantation's operations considerably. The investigation of food stores revealed both expected items and troubling absences. Standard provisions appeared untouched, but specific ingredients showed signs of depletion that didn't match their typical usage rates. Mercier's men found containers that had held cassava roots in quantities far exceeding normal consumption, with processing residue suggesting extraction methods rather than straightforward cooking preparation. The discovery prompted Beaumont to revisit his preliminary diagnosis, the doctor now suspecting cyanide poisoning derived from cassava compounds. This would explain the rapid onset and the specific symptoms he'd observed, and it would require knowledge of traditional processing techniques that very few Europeans possessed. The worker villages that housed enslaved laborers occupied cleared areas approximately 1 kilometer from the main house, positioned close enough for convenient access but distant enough that the presence of hundreds of Africans didn't disturb European sensibilities. Mercier led a contingent of armed men toward these settlements as morning light revealed the full extent of the previous night's rain damage. The paths had become slick red clay that grabbed at boots, while pooled water created obstacles that required careful navigation. The villages themselves consisted of rectangular structures built from woven palm fronds and mud, arranged in rows that emphasized efficiency over any consideration of community or comfort. The colonial officer discovered that the kitchen staff's disappearance represented merely the most visible element of a larger exodus. Dozens of workers had vanished during the night, their departures covered by rain and darkness and the chaos at the main house. Entire families had packed whatever possessions they could carry and fled toward the jungle, abandoning the plantation that had held them in bondage. The remaining workers showed no inclination to provide information about their departed neighbors, responding to questions with blank expressions and claims of ignorance that Mercier recognized as coordinated resistance. Threatening violence produced no better results, the workers apparently having calculated that whatever punishment might follow would be preferable to betraying those who had escaped. Father Matthias eventually produced a list of names from his records, identifying the most likely suspects based on their positions within the kitchen hierarchy. Kimena Okoye headed the list, described as the head cook whose skills had made him valuable enough to receive treatment. Slightly better than field laborers. The priest's notes indicated that Kimena had lost a son 3 months earlier, sold to a trading operation under circumstances that Matthias had documented with obvious disapproval. The missionary's records also mentioned Bisimwa, a younger worker whose sister had been transferred to mining territories under conditions that the priest's careful language couldn't quite disguise as anything other than sexual exploitation. The connection between personal grievances and the poker tournament became apparent when Mercier examined the guest list against the histories of the missing workers. Zimmerman had purchased Kimena's son. Duchamp owned the mining operation where Bisimwa's sister had been sent. Van der Berg had facilitated both transactions while profiting from the sales. Thornhill and Ferreira had been present during conversations where these deals were arranged, their participation making them complicit in the system that treated human beings as transferable assets. The 5 dead men weren't random victims but specifically targeted individuals whose deaths served both revenge and symbolic purposes. Mercier organized search parties that spread out from the plantation in all directions, their orders to locate and apprehend the fugitives by any means necessary. The manhunt would eventually involve hundreds of colonial troops and local auxiliaries, but in those first hours the captain recognized he was already operating at disadvantage. The escaped workers had gained at least 6 hours head start, moving through terrain they understood while pursuers would struggle with unfamiliar landscape. The rain had washed away tracks and sent trails that dogs might otherwise follow. The jungle provided countless hiding places and routes that existed only in the knowledge of people who had lived in these territories for generations. The colonial administration in Leopoldville received reports of the massacre by telegraph before noon, the news spreading through European settlements with the speed that only genuine fear could generate. 5 prominent plantation owners murdered simultaneously during a social gathering represented an attack on the foundations of colonial society. If enslaved kitchen workers could poison their masters with such effectiveness, then every European household in the Congo faced potential threat from servants they had trusted with food preparation and household access. The psychological impact exceeded even the economic disruption caused by removing 5 major players from the region's rubber and resource extraction networks. Governor General Auguste Verbeck issued emergency directives from his offices in Leopoldville, demanding that the perpetrators be captured and executed publicly as example to any other workers who might contemplate similar resistance. He authorized expanded patrols and increased security measures at all major plantations, effectively declaring martial law across territories where the Belgian administration claimed authority. Rewards were posted offering substantial sums for information leading to arrests, though the governor understood that money held limited appeal for people who lived under conditions where even successful informants would remain enslaved. The investigation of the crime scene continued throughout the day as various officials and experts arrived to examine evidence and contribute to the growing understanding of what had occurred. Beaumont's toxicology work confirmed cyanide poisoning, though the sophistication of delivery suggested planning that went beyond simple revenge killing. Someone had calculated dosages with precision, timed the poison's administration to ensure maximum effect during the poker game, and distributed the compound across multiple dishes to guarantee that all targets consumed lethal amounts. The level of knowledge required for such execution pointed toward education and intelligence that Europeans preferred to deny existed among colonized populations. Father Matthias spent the afternoon interviewing remaining workers and reviewing his own extensive records of the African communities under his nominal spiritual guidance. The priest's notes revealed networks of resistance that the colonial administration had either ignored or failed to recognize, communication systems between plantations that allowed information to travel faster than official channels, and instances of coordinated work slowdowns that suggested organizational capabilities that white settlers found deeply unsettling. The poker tournament massacre wasn't an isolated incident of individual revenge but potentially represented part of broader resistance movement that had been developing beneath the surface of apparent submission. The bodies of the 5 plantation owners were prepared for burial with ceremonies appropriate to their status, though the proceedings carried undertones of anxiety that transformed what should have been somber remembrance into something approaching desperate reassurance. European settlers attended the funerals in numbers that overwhelmed the small church in the nearest colonial settlement, their presence reflecting not so much grief for the deceased as fear for their own mortality. The priest conducting services spoke about divine justice and civilizing missions, but his words rang hollow against the reality that 5 powerful men had been brought down by people they dismissed as incapable of complex thought or coordinated action. Mercier's search parties pushed deeper into the jungle, following leads that mostly resulted in empty camps and cold trails. The fugitives had prepared their escape routes in advance, establishing supply caches and safe houses with thoroughness that suggested months of planning. The captain began to understand that he was pursuing not merely fleeing criminals but participants in a resistance network that extended far beyond the Domaine Rouge plantation. Every attempt to interrogate workers produced either silence or information that led nowhere, the collective refusal to cooperate demonstrating solidarity that transcended individual self-interest. The Congo River became the focus of expanded search efforts after scouts discovered evidence that someone had launched a dugout canoe from concealed positions downstream from the estate's primary dock. The river provided access to vast territories where colonial control existed only nominally, regions where communities maintained independence through isolation and strategic resistance. Following fugitives into such areas required resources and commitment that Mercier recognized his superiors might not be willing to provide indefinitely, especially as other security concerns demanded attention across the sprawling colony. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.